Hi, I'm Ben Connolly and welcome to The Unstoppable Photographer, the program designed to take your photography passion and help you turn it into profit. Composition is loosely defined as how the elements of your photo are arranged within the frame. While composition in relation to a photo is generally considered the elements in the frame that you're photographing, I would also challenge you to consider composition as not only those elements, but also the technique in which you use to capture the photo. By that, I mean consider and compose the lighting, the white balance, the subject, as well as things in the frame that make the photo what it is. Anyone can just go out, grab a camera and take a photo, but as a professional and the creative human that you are, I want you to compose your photos with thought and with meaning, as opposed to just setting your camera on auto and waving it around. So as photographers, there's several ways that we can get a story, a feeling, or a point across in a photo. Now, some of these things are lighting, white balance, aperture, and finally composition. Let me ask you, how many times have you seen a photograph that it just seemed to resonate with you for some reason? Like, it might not have been taken in an amazing location or by someone that you know or love, but it just appealed to you. If you can, look at that photo and become aware of how it's lit, what the white balance is, what the depth and the composition is. If you do this, you'll notice a symphony of elements all coming together to make something that's very special. Lighting, white balance, and aperture aside, composition can be made up of many different elements within the frame, or just a few. There's no hard and fast rules of composition. They're more like guidelines to follow. With that said, the technical elements of how to actually take a photo can be taught pretty easily, but composition is something a little bit more creative. It's more personal, and it's what can differentiate you from everyone else's photos. 100 different people could photograph the same thing or the same location, and all of them would most likely have similar levels of exposure, white balance, and that sort of thing. But it's how you as the artist arrange the elements within your frame that will determine whether your photograph is more or less interesting to the viewer than the masses who are photographing the same thing. In this module, I'm going to share with you some of the most common composition practices so you can practice and apply them in your own work. Understanding composition is one of the essential elements to improving your photography. As I previously discussed, there's no hard and fast rules. Instead, there's more guidelines to follow, and I mean literally. There's many different techniques, guidelines, or patterns to create the composition and enhance the interest of your image. These include leading lines, the rule of thirds, vanishing points, and the golden ratio. In order to work out your composition and decide how you're going to compose the photo, the first thing you need to determine is what is it in the actual frame that's grabbed your attention in the first place. Working this out means that you'll work out how to best showcase that particular thing and to draw attention to it. If you're photographing a person in a portrait or a wedding scene, what do you really enjoy about the subject, or what would you like to showcase aesthetically that will grab the viewer's attention? Figure out where you want to draw the viewer's eye, what you want to showcase to them, then utilize the different composition techniques, guidelines, or patterns in the following pages to frame those elements in your photograph. On the following 10 pages, I'm going to share with you some of the most commonly used composition techniques. The rule of thirds. The rule of thirds is really simple. We just divide the frame both horizontally and vertically, leaving you 9 equal rectangles and 4 points of intersection in the frame. These points of intersection are where you can place the main subject or points of interest in the frame, or you can also place your subject along one of the 4 lines. Pretty much all digital cameras will have this rule of thirds guide that you can turn on or off within the camera settings menu, and it can be shown in both the viewfinder and on the back of the screen to assist you in shooting. We tend to have a natural tendency to want to place the main subject of a photo in the middle of the frame. However, placing it off-center using the rule of thirds will more often than not lead to a more attractive and engaging composition. This style of composition encourages the viewer to explore the photo more, to understand why the subject has been placed where it has and what's on the other side of the frame. This makes the photograph much more interesting. You can also use the rule of thirds in post-processing while cropping a photo to use the rule so that the subject falls on one of those intersection points. Finally, the rule of thirds is an excellent starting point for learning composition, and it's a way that you can explore your creativity as a beginner. When it comes to bringing your attention to specific parts of a frame, leading lines are one of the best and easiest ways to do this. You just can't miss a strong leading line pointing directly at the subject to catch the viewer's eye. Leading lines, as their name implies, are just that, lines that point you into the frame towards the subject. Really, all you need is 2 lines that lead to your subject. You can also have multiple lines that converge to a single point or towards the subject. When you're utilizing this style of composition, try whenever possible to bring the leading lines in from the corners or the edges of the frame so that the viewer has a solid reference. Things like rivers, streams, paths, patterns and fences are great items to incorporate in your frame to create leading lines to your subject. Leading lines really help the viewer through the image and get their focus and attention on the important elements quickly. Leading lines also don't necessarily have to be straight, as long as they converge on the subject or a point of interest enough to guide the eye of the viewer to that point. Framing depth, or a frame within a frame. Including a frame within a frame is one of my favorite ways to effectively portray depth and draw deliberate attention to a subject. So, what's a frame within a frame? These can be elements such as windows, arches, overhanging branches, or even lights to frame your scene with. But the best thing of all is the frame doesn't necessarily have to surround the entire scene to be effective. Frames also don't have to be man-made objects such as arches or windows, and they can be present in either the foreground, the middle ground, or the background because they don't necessarily have to surround the entire subject. Frames are a great photographic element that you can use to lead the viewer's eyes into the scene to a very deliberate point. Frames can be anything that you can shoot through to highlight depth and draw attention to your subject. One thing to remember with creating a frame within a frame is that your frame doesn't necessarily have to be exposed darker than your subject, like in the case of shooting through fairy lights. Just bear in mind that the bright highlights of your lights might distract the viewer and take their attention away from the subject, thus creating confusion in your photo. A frame in the foreground creates a build-up to a central part of the scene, and it can carry equal weight through the rest of the scene. You can also place your frame in the background and your main subject in the foreground, and this creates interesting photos.